Let's see, audio recording also on. Great. Alrighty. So I'm here today with Tara Ross, who is an historian extraordinaire, particularly of the American presidency and of the Electoral College. And we're going to talk about all that fun stuff and some Coolidge and American history and all the fun things that all the Coolidge fans love. I should mention that I'm Rushad Thomas, and I'm the program and editorial associate here at the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. So, Tara, how did you originally get interested in American history and the presidency and the Electoral College?
Oh, those might all be different questions, just so you know. The best thing that got me interested in American politics was that I went overseas in 1992. It was just a church trip kind of thing, but I went to Romania, and I saw how blessed we are. And that's just the long and short of it. And I came back and cared much more about pretty much everything after that. And the reason I started working on the Electoral College is a funnier story. It is because I broke my arm in law school, and I am not making this up. I was in my last semester, and I was editor of a law review, and I had broken my arm, and I needed to still finish classes and graduate, and I couldn't take notes anymore. So I solved the problem by doing half writing courses so I could peck with one hand on a keyboard. And then the rest of the classes I figured I'd cram at the end, which almost didn't work for me. But one of the writing things that I did was an independent study on the Electoral College, which was very easy then because all of that stuff with Bush and Gore had just happened, and there was a lot of information readily available. Okay. And what I discovered during that was that this Electoral College is way more interesting than, or more important than I'd ever given it credit for. I just didn't know enough about it. And I think a lot of Americans are in a very, very similar situation. I never learned about the Electoral College when I was growing up in grade school or in high school, or, if I did, it was a very small tangent in some course. So it's much more important than we realize, and it holds our republic together much more than we realize. So, and this year, of course, everything's really interesting.
Right.
So I'm sure people will be investigating even more, which is a good thing.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, could you explain how the Electoral College works? Because I'm sure, most Americans haven't the slightest clue.
Sure. So the best way to think about it is when you go to the polls on Election Day, you're not casting a vote for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or one of the third-party candidates. You're actually casting a ballot for a slate of presidential electors. Now, there are 51 of these elections all over the country. So I'm in Texas. You're in Vermont. Those are different elections for different slates of electors. They operate under, to some degree, their own state rules. I mean, it's literally a completely different election. In my state, we will see who wins the Texas election and which slate of electors will go to represent us at a later vote in December. And all of the states do this. So we have, my point is, we have one part of the election that is purely democratic. People like to allege that the Electoral College is not democratic, and I dispute that. The Electoral College, as it operates today, is purely democratic at the state level. But then we combine it with a dose of federalism. And that is a good thing because it forces presidential candidates to go out and vote, or to go out and to appeal to a wide variety of voters from different states or different regions or different subcultures in this country. So that December election, all of the electors that have been elected on Election Day go there and they cast their ballots. And it takes a majority of those 538 electors to win the presidential election.
Wow, that's that's fascinating. And I heard oftentimes people saying that it would be better if we go to a direct system where we just, like any other election on the ballot, we just elect the person directly to the office, the president directly to the office, and get rid of the 51 different state elections for the presidency and just go to a national plebiscite. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think it's a horrible idea. And I think, honestly, the Republican primaries this year are a case in point as to why that is so. I mean, I've been saying for 15 years now, if we get rid of the Electoral College, our elections will generate into the kind of thing that you see overseas too often, where it's a fractured multi-party affair. There's no incentive to build coalitions, to unify, to work together, to try to understand voters that are not like yourself, which is what happened in the Republican primaries this year, whether you're happy or not happy about the outcome. And then a candidate at the end of it is elected with plurality support. There's no requirement for a majority of anything, not electors, not voters, not anything. And so you end up with a very, very fractured body of electors or of voters, and I don't think that's healthy for our country. Our country is so big, so diverse, so great, but we need something that encourages the one person who is expected to represent all of us, to go out and to appeal and to understand a wide variety of voters.
Well, what do you say to people in states like, Texas or California or New York, who feel like people who, like myself, I work in Vermont, but I live in New Hampshire, which is, a super tiny state, but gets all this outside attention, all out of proportion to its size. What do you say to people in the big states who feel like they're kind of neglected by the way our electoral system operates?
Well, I would say a couple things. One is safe and swing states are not. There's nothing permanent about that. They change all the time. Texas used to be a Democrat. State like Utah, I'm not sure what's going to happen to that this year. They don't like Clinton and they don't like Trump. Who knows what's going to happen to Utah? I mean, even states that are that you think are so safe are not necessarily. In 2000, West Virginia, a very safe blue state, really safe blue state, had not voted for Republican in a long time, not counting the Reagan landslide. But West Virginia, which was so safely blue, went for George W. Bush. The Democrats lost it, and the reason they lost it is because they weren't paying attention to that state. They took it for granted. The environmental concerns, they went too far, and so anyway, safe and swing states, they change. They change based on what's going on. There's nothing static about that. The other thing I would say is the big states are not unimportant. They aren't ignored. They made up their minds earlier. Okay, there's no Democrat that wants to go into an election thinking that California is in danger, and there is no Republican that wants to go into an election thinking Texas is in danger. They are important. They have just already made up their minds. So, some people, I'll say in Texas, I'm kind of happy. I don't have to go and listen to all those campaign commercials at the end. But I don't know. I am sure it is really frustrating to be a Democrat in Texas. But if that's the case, then you're probably also frustrated in your gubernatorial elections and in your other statewide offices. And so really, you have work to do. And I don't mean to be unsympathetic, but you have work to do to convince other people in your state that your way of looking at things is the right way to look at things. And that's healthy, by the way. I mean, competition is good for anybody.
Right. Yeah, I grew up in Florida, and I was in 5th grade, 6th grade maybe during the 2000 election, and I remember all that subterfuge and whatnot, and the fact that in the 2000 election, Florida decided the election in favor of President Bush, but Al Gore didn't win the popular vote. President Bush didn't win the electoral vote. Yeah, Al Gore won the popular vote. How many times in American history has that happened? It's not very often, is it?
No. So that's really only the second indisputable. You will hear people cite 1824 and 1876, but there were other things going on in those years, and I don't think they're good examples. In 1888, Grover Cleveland lost the election even though he'd won the popular vote. Now, if you look at that, the reason that happened is because his vote or his support was skewed towards the South. He was perceived. He was then the incumbent president, but he was perceived as a guy who only represented the South and who cared more about Southern issues. Whether that was true or not, that's just how he was perceived. And so he ended up winning these huge landslides in a few Southern states, but then he couldn't do very well anyplace else. So, by contrast, Benjamin Harrison, who ended up winning the election, just had more spread out appeal across the rest of the nation. And so he ended up winning the election. And I would argue that that's a healthy, good thing in a country as big as our own. And by the way, Grover Cleveland himself seems to have learned this lesson. He came back 4 years later. He ran a much more national campaign than he had in 1888, and he ended up winning the election. So he's our only president with a split term. Was an incumbent, not elected, then reelected again. So he learned the lesson that the Electoral College had to teach him, and I consider all of this healthy dynamics in a big, diverse country.
Right. And in a country that is a federal system where we do have 50 different states, really 50 different polities. I agree with you. I think that it's important to have the polities of each different state represented. I mean, you're right. It's a very diverse state, even from Vermont to New Hampshire. There are major differences. The Connecticut River is a hard border. So yeah, that's absolutely important. I'd like to talk a little bit about President Coolidge's 2 times on a presidential ballot. Well, I guess the first time he was vice presidential, 1920 and 1924.
Right.
20 was an interesting year because, of course, women had first gotten the right to vote that year. And I'm also a fan of pointing out that Calvin Coolidge defeated Franklin Roosevelt in 1920.
Right. That's true.
Yes. The only Republican to do so. But yeah, so when we were going into sort of the early part of the 20th century, what was the Electoral College sort of setup like? Like how were the voting patterns at the time, and which states had the most clout in those years?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I would have to go look at a map just to be honest. I mean, I think what was really driving the country that year is they were coming off of World War I.
Right.
They were coming off of Woodrow Wilson, who was really progressive, and there were higher tax rates, more government controls on a lot of things, and people were just getting tired of it, and people were struggling, and they weren't doing well. And Harding, I'm not sure he was such a great candidate, but he was better than the other side, and Coolidge had been put on the VP slot because of how he had handled the Boston police strike, and he had gained a lot of national appeal from that. And they wanted to come in, and their whole thing was, we're going to return this country kind of back to pre-war normal. Yeah, let's go back to what it was, and everybody wanted that. That was appealing, and so they won, and they won pretty handily. Yeah, and the other side didn't really stand a chance, probably.
The Wilson experience, the last couple of years of the Wilson administration, I think, crippled the Democratic Party all through the 1920s. Like the fact that we were so heavily in debt, and that he failed to get the League of Nations through, and really he went about it in such a really a way that rubbed most of the senators, particularly the Republican senators who controlled the chamber, in such a wrong way. That the Democrats didn't win a presidential election again until Franklin Roosevelt, 1932.
Right.
And then I would quibble because I have a really soft spot for Warren Harding in my heart. I would say he was a really good presidential candidate, but he wasn't and he was a good president too. I think he was a very good president. He started the country on the trajectory that Coolidge would fulfill of cutting taxes, and he implemented the Bureau of the Budget in 1921. The first time the White House had a really direct involvement in crafting the federal budget, and starting to pay down the national debt from the Wilson administration with the war. It was sort of the ethical stuff that was a big problem. That tripped up Harding, for sure. And of course, President Coolidge was above all of it. He just, put shoulder to the wheel and focused on the important stuff, which was cutting taxes, reducing regulations, and extending economic freedom to the American people.
He was great.
Amen. And I think the 24 election is another interesting one that's sort of forgotten about. But one of our board members, and speaking of which, you're not trained in history, are you? You don't have a history degree.
Not technically.
Yeah.
I'm not. I've got a law degree. I
Yeah.
think the law degree has taught me to research and to be really anal.
Right.
And to, I'm just good at digging in and not accepting things at face value, probably.
Well, you know what I have found I'm a history buff. I love history. I read a lot of history. But what I found is that the best history is written by non-historians. In my experience of reading history. But anyways, we have a trustee of the Coolidge Foundation called Garland Tucker from North Carolina who literally wrote the book on the 1924 presidential election. It's called The High Tide of American Conservatism. And it was such an interesting year because it was a three-party or a three-way race. In some respects, we have a three-way race this year with Gary Johnson. Although I don't know how well that's. I doubt that it's going to pan out to anything revolutionary. But
the great thing about the Electoral College is that, look, I think it's a good thing that it squashes most third parties because when you do that, you squash the George Wallaces of the world. And that's a good thing. We don't want extremist we just don't want that. We don't want them to win based on some plurality, whatever, and get into office. But the other thing about the Electoral College is large, reasonable third parties can influence the process. So this year to me is really interesting. Okay, so again, just talking pure poll numbers, not trying to impugn or praise anybody on the ticket. People are really unhappy, and both Clinton and Trump, they are not unifiers, or don't appear to be. Look, maybe they'll try harder, maybe they can change or something. But for now, that doesn't appear to be what they're doing, and that's what the Electoral College requires. Now, historically, a candidate like Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton would lose. They're like George McGovern, right? And they get killed in a landslide. People with those kinds of numbers is what I mean. People with that kind of discontent, disapproval rating, that people generally don't like them as much, and so, or trust them or whatever. So if people like Donald Trump normally lose and people like Hillary Clinton normally lose, and if both parties have effectively nominated George McGovern, that makes me think that there is more room for a third party than normal.
Right.
That's still an uphill battle. It's still, look, historically, it doesn't work. I'm the first one to say it. But also, historically, both parties have never nominated George McGovern simultaneously.
That's a very good point.
So that makes me wonder. It just makes me wonder what would happen if people started evaluating the third-party candidates. And is there a third-party candidate? I don't know. Is there a third-party candidate that will unify the nation, that can appeal to a broad cross-section? The Electoral College rewards the person who builds the best coalition. And if that's a third-party candidate, I do think the third-party candidate will win. But that's a big road to hoe. I'm not making light of that. I just think it's interesting because both parties have never nominated somebody so disliked at the same time.
Right.
Usually one party does that and the other party doesn't. And, so the answer is kind of obvious as to what's going to happen. But I just think it's an interesting year to watch.
Definitely. Do you remember or do you recall when was the last time a third-party candidate won any Electoral College votes?
Well, probably won any votes at all.
Yeah.
Oh,
not won the election.
No, I mean it would be. Oh gosh.
Would it be George Wallace? In
it might be.
I think it might be.
You know what? I need to think about that.
Because Ross Perot wouldn't have won.
Because he didn't win any electoral votes, and there was I want to say in '76 there was somebody else got a vote, but I think it was a Faithless elector that caused that, an actual third-party candidacy.
Would you talk about Faithless electors?
Well, yeah. I mean, there are those. There aren't that many of them. There haven't been that many historically, but there was I believe there was in 1976. So
it's
in my book.
Right.
I'm not always good at remembering numbers without
So,
having it from me.
if there are enough faithless electors to
Mm-hmm.
not vote for the person that the people voted for,
Right.
does that just mean that we get who they decide?
Yep. Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so interesting. So there's no mechanism to overturn a faithless electoral college vote.
Well, I think the real answer is it's never been legally tested because there's never been cause for that. I mean, there literally have been, I think it's less than 20 faithless electors, indisputably faithless electors ever. And most of those were cast at a time when, oh, that reminds me, there was a faithless elector in 2000, but she abstained. She didn't vote for somebody else. She abstained. But she was making a political point. She was protesting the lack of representation for D.C. And
Okay.
I believe she's on record saying if her vote would have swung it to Gore, there was no way she was choosing that time to make a political statement, you know. And most of those faithless electors have been like that. So the open legal question is, there are states that try to bind their electors and to say you have to go this way no matter what. The question is, can the states do that, or do the electors have a free speech right to do what they want to do? And really, you're just electing the person. And so it's kind of an open question. Is probably the best thing I can tell you.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And even going to the question of how the electors are chosen. Originally, when the Electoral College was founded at the beginning of the Republic, there was no like popular vote at all, right? For the electors.
Well, every state did something different, and so
Okay.
it has gone towards popular vote over time. But in the first presidential election, some state legislatures selected their electors. Some divided up their state, not for a congressional district, but a whole different division. Okay, now you guys each select your elector. I mean, there was a whole bunch of different ways that they did it. By about 1836, most states had moved to just a popular vote system of some sort. And of course, today, everybody does it, and almost everybody's winner take all. There are two exceptions to that. Maine and Nebraska are exceptions. They both use a congressional district system. So each congressional district, the winner of that district gets their elector, and then there's two at-large votes for the state.
Right. And that there's only been one instance in recent history where one of those two states had a split decision. So I think it was Nebraska
It was Nebraska.
2008.
It was Nebraska.
Yeah, the district centered in Omaha.
They've only got 5 and 4 electoral votes, so it's kind of mathematically possible, but difficult to actually come up with a situation where you'd split. But other states have considered doing something like that. So far, nobody's done it. The great thing about the Electoral College and federalism is that any state can do whatever it wants. There's nothing stopping anybody from doing that today.
Right.
They can do it. Just a lot of states haven't wanted to. So.
And that might be, speaking of or thinking of ways to placate the minority parties in states like California and Texas, going to a Maine or Nebraska system might be a good way to placate those folks. Yeah. I doubt. Yeah. I doubt that the majority party would like that. But
yeah, I mean, there's pros and cons. So I just stay out of it. I think, look, each state make its own decision. I think different things make sense for different states. In Texas, I do think we would have a hard time because of the gerrymandering thing is already pretty bad. And so if you add the presidential race to that, that's something to consider.
Right.
I'm sure there's other benefits too. I think something else to consider is, would we really make people happy, or would we just say, okay, now instead of having the swing state problem, we've got a swing state problem, right? And instead of worrying about, whatever for Iowa farmers, now we're worrying about, people in Dallas want a bike trail. I mean, it's just you might be switching one problem for another. So at the end of the day, the presidential candidate needs to be able to win many simultaneous victories across this great nation of ours. And that is the best way to succeed in the Electoral College. And that's a great incentive for our presidential election process.
Quite right. Well, Tara, I won't keep you any longer. I thank you so much for speaking with me. This has been great. I hope all of our listeners enjoyed the conversation.
I'm always so glad to talk Coolidge and Electoral College.
Yes, sounds good. Take care.
Thank you.